Seems like every week I get up here to speak, things get better and better and simpler in our world, don't they? As the ground seems to shift beneath the feet of nations, one of the best ways for us to navigate what we see in our hearts and in our minds is to look at how God treated nations in the Old Testament. Amen. The United Kingdom, once the people called out for a king rather than God, started with Saul. Saul, David, and then his son Solomon. We know them fairly well. After that, it maybe gets a little bit fuzzy in our history. In 1 Kings 11:11, God informs Solomon that he is going to tear the nation out of his hands and give it to his servant Jeroboam. But that he would allow part of the land of the nation, Judah and part of Benjamin, leave that with his son Rehoboam. And so that's where we have the divided kingdom that really starts in 1 Kings 12. And so we have Jeroboam, who becomes the king in the north. And it says that one of the first things he does is he sets up altars in Dan in the north and Bethel in the south, and convinces the people that they don't need to obey the law and go down and worship in Jerusalem. Why would you do that? That's inconvenient. And in that way, he leads them into sin. He immediately changes the way they approach God in worship. There's a whole lesson in there. The northern kingdom has 19 kings. None of them were good. None. And they didn't last very long. In 720 BC, they went into Assyrian captivity, never to return. The southern kingdom had 20 kings, and some of them were really good, and some of them were really bad, and some of them were kind of in the middle. It's kind of a strange thing. We're going to look at that. They lasted almost 200 years longer than the northern kingdom, but eventually went into Babylonian captivity in 586. Of course, they returned, their descendants returned later with Ezra, Nehemiah, Zerubbabel. They rebuilt the temple, the walls, reestablished the law after their Babylonian captivity. And we have those historical records as well. I want to look at one particular king who you may not know anything about. And this is one of the things that I've kind of purposed myself to sort of wrapping my head around, is the historical story, the narrative of all of these kings and how they fit together with the different prophets who prophesied during their different reigns and things like that. It's all very fascinating, but can be a little bit much to bite off and chew. I want to look at one who was, I believe he was the 9th king of the southern kingdom. And he wasn't evil, but he wasn't great. And one of the ways that I would describe his reign and his life, and we're going to look at really his entire reign. It's all in 2 Chronicles 25. I'm not going to have anything up on the screen or anything. We're just going to stay in this one chapter, and we're not going to go anywhere else. But what I would call his reign is really a tragedy. And one of the first things that I'll tell you is that there are many Christian lives, many people who are Christians, whose lives end up being a tragedy because they made the same mistake as this king. Now, there's a lot of books in the Old Testament, so if you go to Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. We're in 2nd Chronicles 25. And you can think of 1st and 2nd Kings as giving us a bulk of the information about the kings and their reigns, and then 1st and 2nd Chronicles really parallels that. And they're really just history books that tell us what happened to these people. And if we will learn from them, as the New Testament says, if we will learn from them, and we will keep from making their mistakes. Verse 1, 2 Chronicles 25 and verses 1 and 2 really set the stage for this. Amaziah, that's what we're looking at. King Amaziah was 25 years old when he began to reign. And he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. Now just want to clarify that he gets into some trouble and he ends up reigning at the same time as his son, Uzziah. And so there's what you call a co-regency. And so all of this 29 years, he's actually not really reigning because he runs into some trouble that we're going to see. His mother's name was Jehoiada of Jerusalem, and he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. And that's a good statement. And that's a statement that I want people to say about me. But I'll read it again, and I'll read the whole sentence. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, yet not with a whole heart. It's become fashionable, and we've bought the lie that it's okay to be a Christian, but not with your whole heart. As long as you're a Christian, it's okay. It's okay if your heart's divided just a little bit. But what does it mean to serve, but not with a whole heart? You know, when I grew up playing baseball, I played football for one day, and I wasn't having it anymore because they were screaming at me and I didn't know why. Baseball was my sport, and one of the things we learned fairly early on is when you went out to your position, you don't walk. You don't walk to your position. Maybe the first baseman because it's like 5 feet, right? Or the pitcher because he's going to get tired and they're so delicate, right? I was a pitcher. But I played the outfield, and so that's, about a 100-yard sprint, really. And that's what they expected you to do. And they used the term that is the term we use in sports, hustle. And if you didn't run so fast that you were out of breath when you got your position, then that says something about your commitment, to your determination, to what you're willing to bring. And there's some people that were just lazy and they kind of didn't care. They took it for granted, and they were kind of sloppy players and made errors, and they weren't that great. Never really pushed themselves, so they weren't really fast. I recently went out to eat somewhere. I can't remember where, but I distinctly remember that we couldn't find our server for like 25 minutes. Finally, I think I looked out the window or something, and she's out there smoking. And she didn't have a care in the world about my Diet Coke. And look, things that are going on in our nation are really serious right now, but my Diet Coke is like, number 3 probably, all right? She didn't care at all. She was serving me, but not with her whole heart. Don't you love it when a server they go above and beyond? It's like you blinked and they brought you more free bread or chips. It's like the best thing ever. You're like, this person does magic. How are they doing this? You can tell the difference. We're not talking about a heart of emotion. We're talking about a chosen purpose. I hope to be married one day, but I don't want anyone to ever marry me who will become my wife, but not with a whole heart. How devastating would that be to the marriage? And we're talking about a choice. This is a choice of what you will purpose yourself to do in serving within your duty, within the relationship. And that's what we're talking about. That gives us a good perspective of what was going on with Amaziah. He was king. He was 25, which is pretty young, not old enough to be president, right? Barely old enough to be in the House of Representatives today. He's a pretty young person. And he's thrust into this situation. And he has the title of king. And he seems to be just kind of going through the motions that are what's right in the eyes of God. But if we read through this chapter, through this story, what we'll find is this. If you're a Christian and you're going through the motions, but you're serving God not with a whole heart, there are going to be particular decisions that you're going to make. There are a long list of decisions that you will make if you're serving God but not with a whole heart. I just want to look at the ones that we can bring out of this chapter. But I'll tell you, the end of the story is that the decisions you make because you serve God and do what's right in His eyes but not with a whole heart, the story ends in tragedy. And so what does it look like when a person serves God but not with a whole heart? What kind of decisions do they make? Let's go down to verse 5. I encourage you to go with me there. 2 Chronicles 25. 2 Chronicles 25. Verse 5. We're going to look at verses 5 through 13, and I'll kind of comment as we go. There are three sections and three real takeaways. Three decisions that people make, that this guy made when they serve God but not with a whole heart. 2 Chronicles 25, verse 5. Then Amaziah assembled the men of Judah and sent them by fathers' houses under commanders of thousands and of hundreds for all Judah and Benjamin. Those are the two tribes that he had, right? He mustered those 20 years old and upward and found that they were 300,000 choice men, fit for war, able to handle spear and shield. Now, this is paralleled, or a lot of the story is found in 2 Kings 13 and 14. And so it will be mentioned in a moment, but the backstory is that he's going to war with the Edomites. And so he's raising up an army. And he has 300,000 that will fight for him. Now, if he knows anything about history, what can God do with 300,000 men? What can God do with 300 men, right? But here's what he does, verse 6. He hired also 100,000 mighty men of valor from Israel, the northern kingdom, the kingdom where no kings were faithful. He hired 100,000 men, mighty men of valor from Israel for 100 talents of silver. But a man of God, a prophet, came to him and said, O king, do not let the army of Israel go with you, for the Lord is not with Israel. Why are you seeking them to fight with you? The Lord's not with them. The Lord is not with Israel, with all these Ephraimites. They're from the tribe of Ephraim. Verse 8, but go, act, be strong for the battle. Why should you suppose that God will cast you down before the enemy? Why do you have any inkling of an idea that you're going to be defeated, that God's going to allow you to fall, so that you have to hire reinforcements that God is not with? For God has power to help or to cast down. And Amaziah said to the man of God, but what shall we do about the 100 talents that I have given to the army of Israel? What about the money I paid them, right? That's just out of my pocket. And the man of God answered, the Lord is able to give you much more than this. And Amaziah discharged the army that had come to him from Ephraim to go home again. And they became very angry with Judah. They kept their money, but they still wanted to fight and were angry. All right? So it says they were very angry with Judah and returned home in fierce anger. But Amaziah took courage and led out his people and went to the valley of Salt and struck down 10,000 men of Seir. Those are the Edomites. The men of Judah captured another 10,000 alive and took them to the top of a rock and threw them down from the top of the rock, and they were all dashed to pieces. But the men of the army who Amaziah sent back, the Israelites, who God wasn't with, he says, not letting them go with him in battle, they raided the cities of Judah from Samaria to Beth Horon and struck down 3,000 people in them and took much spoil. Now, Suspend that in your mind. We'll come back to it in a minute. That the people that he said, no, go home and you're not going to fight with me, they ended up going and terrorizing part of his kingdom and killing 3,000 people. But what's one of the first decisions that he makes when he's serving God, but not with a whole heart? I would tell you that the first decision is this, that he partnered with the wrong people. He partnered with the wrong people. He partnered with people that were not within the blessings of God. And we have been warned from beginning to end in this book that darkness and light don't mix. And yet, the mistakes that we make when we serve God but not with a whole heart is this. We think that it's okay to allow people who are not in Christ, who are not living in the blessings of Christ, who do not have the same eternity as us, we allow them to come close, and we partner with them, and we get so close to them and think nothing of it. And we mock God, who says in 1 Corinthians 15:33, evil companionship corrupts good morals. Or what Paul said in 2 Corinthians about not being unequally yoked, about partnering. We allow those who are not godly to come in and to influence us, and we align ourselves with them. As I talked about one of my last lessons, if they are going a different direction than we are, then how is it that we can align ourselves with them and think that the path that we are going is not going to be altered by their influence? Now, God steps in and says, hey, what are you doing? You don't need to do that. You're not discerning. And that's part of it is that when you serve God but not with a whole heart, then you don't have very good judgment. You lack discernment because your priority is not to give God your whole heart. Your priority is sort of just to kind of go through the motions and to just kind of live life and hope that everybody leaves you alone. And that seems to be what Amaziah was thinking. I'm just going to kind of do my thing and just hope that people leave me alone. But God continues to challenge him. When you serve God but not with a whole heart, it's not a priority to surround yourself by people who are also faithful. I mean, what does that tell us, though? Because this is sort of a spiritual barometer or something that we can think about. Have I allowed people who are not Christians to come in and strongly influence my life, and rather than me strongly influencing them, it tells me something about my service for God and whether it's wholehearted or not. Let's continue in the story. 2 Chronicles 25, verse 14. Verse 14. Just 14, 15, and 16. After Amaziah came from striking down the Edomites, see, he won. God blessed him. He brought the gods of the men of Seir. He brought their idols of the men of Seir and set them up as his gods and worshipped them, making offerings to them. You know, this is the face palm. What is this guy doing? I don't. There are many times, if you're like me, where you see Christians make decisions and you just think, this doesn't make any sense. The lack of discernment and judgment that we see, that we can all fall into, is a matter of kind of going through the motions of serving God and having a label as Christian, but not with a whole heart. We haven't prioritized the fact that God's going to be our master and that we aren't going to allow any other masters to compete with him. But this guy was like, you know what? We defeated them, so we're just going to take their gods too, because it's sort of the idea that, you know, I have one Lucky Charm over here, not the cereal, and why can't I have some more Lucky Charms, right? I need all the luck I can get. It's sort of this sort of superstitious idea almost. This collecting of gods. This weird idea that that your heart is capable of serving multiple gods without resenting some of them. Verse 15, therefore the Lord was angry with Amaziah and sent to him a prophet who said to him, why have you sought the gods of the people who did not deliver their own people from your hand? Why in the world are you taking these gods as if they're going to help you? And they didn't even help the people that you defeated. It doesn't even make any sense. There's no logic to it. And there isn't any logic to decisions of people who serve God but not with a whole heart. They're not thinking clear. And they are not wanting to see, because look, serving God with a whole heart is a choice. And so to serve God but not with a whole heart is a choice not to think correctly, not to discern. It's not a priority to use good judgment. And look what he does. This is amazing to me. Verse 16, but as he was speaking, this is the prophet of God who's interjecting himself in the situation like he did before. Hey, you hired those guys. Those guys are not being blessed by God. God's not with them. Don't bring them into battle. God can save you without them. And this time he brings these idols in, and the prophet of God is sent in again, and he says, look, why are you bringing them in? It doesn't even make any sense. Those gods are nothing. You know, I'm reminded of what Paul said about thinking that an idol is something when it's nothing. It's just a dumb or a mute idol. And I think about Gideon and tearing down the idol of Baal, and then he gets the name Jerubbaal, which means let Baal contend for himself. Let Baal fight for himself. The whole idea here that these idols, these gods didn't even fight for their own people. Why do you think they're going to fight for you? And yet we divide when we serve God but not with a whole heart. We divide our trust. We divide our trust between God and other things. The world convinces us of this. You think, I need to trust in God, but I also need to trust. I need to trust over here. And God warns him, why are you doing this? And in the middle of his speech, the king cuts him off. The king says, I don't want to hear what God has to say. Boy, that's a dangerous place to be. The king says to him, have we made you a royal counselor? You almost hear like the smugness of it. You know, who are you to talk to the king, right? He's the prophet of God. Who are you to talk to royalty? Stop. Why should you be struck down? He's like, are you trying to get killed? So the prophet stopped, but said one last thing. He said, I know that God has determined to destroy you because you have done this and have not listened to my counsel. So the first thing that someone in this story, the first decision that somebody makes when they serve God but not with a whole heart is that they partner themselves with the wrong people. They partner themselves with people who are not with God, or not being blessed by God, who are not in Christ. But the second thing they do is, the second tragic decision is that they trust in the wrong things. You trust in the wrong things. You see, when you serve God but not with a whole heart, what you begin to do is you begin to hate and resent worshiping God. And why is that? Why would you begin to hate and resent worshiping God? Because worship will convict us of the truth. We will hate the idea of someone quoting a scripture or someone coming to us and helping to give us some guidance or warning us about something. And we'll resent them. Because when we serve God, but not with a whole heart, then we've chosen that we don't really want our hearts to be convicted of the truth. We don't really want to do what's right. The dueling of masters that Jesus describes is a relentless battle that we all fight. At every turn, the world is trying to convince us to trust in things other than God. And when we give into that just a little bit, then after a while, we don't even want to hear what God has to say. Sort of a parallel here, all right? Let's say you have a credit card, all right? And let's say you keep a balance on that credit card. You don't pay it off at the end of the month. In fact, just the fact you have a credit card altogether. Let me ask you, do you want to listen to anything that Dave Ramsey has to say to you, the money guru? No. You just, if he goes on the radio, you just want to turn that off, right? Because what's he going to tell you? He's going to confront you. And he's going to say, no, you don't need to be doing this. You don't need to be living this way. And if you're not ready to do what's right at that moment, what are you going to do? You say, no, not today. I don't want to listen to it. But people do that with God, and people do that with godly people who are offering counsel all the time when they're serving God, but not with a whole heart. Because they've allowed idols to come in, being convinced that those idols are going to help in some way, when it's all just deception. When I think about people who are become Christians and they later leave God, it's typically after quite a long time of allowing the masters to battle within us and to battle over our heart. And it becomes this steady spiritual degeneration that we sort of spiral down. And after a while, we just don't want to hear it anymore. After a while, we just have a callous heart. That's what's happened to him. Can you imagine if God came to you and started talking to you, and you just said, I don't want to listen to it? That's a terrifying place to be. But there are many Christians who don't realize it, but they're there. And they don't want to hear anything that will confront them. And so the first thing, because I don't have these up on the screen, I just want to repeat them, because some people say, hey, I don't have any idea what your points were. The first one is you partner with the wrong people when you serve God without the wrong heart. What else did Amaziah do? He trusted in the wrong things. He trusted in the wrong things. The things that couldn't save him, the things that couldn't help him. Which brings us to verse 17. 2 Chronicles 25:17. Then Amaziah, king of Judah, took counsel and sent to Joash, the son of Jehoahaz, son of Jehu, king of Israel. So he sends someone to the king of Israel, to the northern kingdom. The kingdom that he hired these other soldiers from. Remember those guys who went through and terrorized and killed a bunch of people in Judah? He sends to them and says, come, let us look one another in the face. Let's have a meeting face to face. And Joash, the king of Israel, sent word to Amaziah, king of Judah. And he sort of gives him a colorful illustration here, because he knows what this is about. He knows that Amaziah wants to address the fact that the Israelite soldiers did evil in Judah. Look at what Joash, the word that he sends to Amaziah. In verse 18, he says this, a thistle, that's a small, brittle plant, a thistle on Lebanon sent to a cedar on Lebanon, that's a large tree, saying, give your daughter to my son for a wife. And a wild beast of Lebanon passed by and trampled down the thistle. In other words, you're having a bit of a misconception about who you are. You're wanting to come to me for confrontation, but you're really just this little brittle piece of plant, and I'm this mighty cedar, and you're nothing. Verse 19. You say, so this is the king of Israel telling the king Amaziah of Judah, he's like, this is what you're saying in your heart. See, I have struck down Edom. I've defeated these people. And your heart has lifted you up in boastfulness. And so he tells him, he says, stay home. Why should you provoke trouble so that you fall? You and Judah with you. So he wants to go to war about what those soldiers did. You could say that it's justified even. But even the northern king is able to look at him and see within his heart that he is not in a good place. He doesn't have good self-perception. He's not really aware of his own status. You might say his own spiritual status. Verse 20, it says, but Amaziah would not listen, for it was of God. Remember the prophet told him what? God's going to destroy you. For it was of God in order that he might give them into the hand of their enemies, because they had sought the gods of Edom. And so because he had trusted in the gods of the Edomites, he didn't want to hear what God had to say anymore. Then he ends up going to war with Israel. And I'll just give you sort of the cliff notes of what happens through the rest of the chapter. They whip up on him pretty good. And they take him back down to Jerusalem, and they tear up a few hundred yards of the wall of Jerusalem. They tear it down. And they take people hostage, and they do all sorts of bad stuff. They don't actually kill him, though. He ends up going into exile, and then his own people from Jerusalem, well, they send assassins, and they take him out. And his end is no good. It's tragic. He was the king. God was with him. He served God, but not with a whole heart. Because of that, he partnered himself with the wrong people. He trusted in the wrong things. And thirdly, he became prideful. And maybe a better way to think of it is he became delusional. He was lying to himself about who he is. The only way that someone is going to have God speaking to them and then say, I don't want to hear about it, is because they're delusional about their status, about who they are. And even the king of Israel could see it, and he says, look, you're boastful. You're lifted up in your own eyes. You're bigger than who you think you are. Or excuse me, you're not as big as you think you are. You're delusional. And so what happens? What happened with him when you serve God but not with a whole heart? You no longer see yourself for your true spiritual state. You think of the first of the Beatitudes. You're no longer poor in spirit. You no longer see your own inadequacy before God. You're great and grand in spirit, and you can do anything. You're not humble before God. And so, when Christians serve God but not with a whole heart, just like this guy, they become delusional and blind to the fact that their faith is actually not a wholehearted faith. And that's a scary place to be, where you believe the lie that you're telling yourself. That's where he was. That's where he was. Within, you might say, mainstream Christendom today, it's sort of become the norm to serve God, but to serve him in this way. To serve him, but not with a whole heart. To be a Christian and to say some of the right things, but in the end, a lot of the time we're aligning ourselves and partnering ourselves with people who are ungodly and who will take us to hell with them. And when we serve God but not with a whole heart, we end up trusting in things other than God to the extent that we resent him when he confronts us within our mistakes. When he confronts the fact that we're trusting in things that are only going to let us down in the end. When we serve God but not with a whole heart, we believe the lie that we can kind of give our heart to other things and still remain within the blessings of God. And God says, no, it doesn't work that way. I want your whole heart. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, he says. And that's not an emotional reaction. It's a choice that this king didn't make. He was unwise, undiscerning. went through the motions, and it ended in tragedy. I just want to throw this out there that I have a couple more pages of notes that I have decided I'm not even going to get into. Because there are so many places in Scripture that little fingers from this passage go out and they attach to, and they parallel with so many other stories and so many other lessons. But there's enough here just to draw out of this. And when we serve God, we haven't purposed ourselves to do it with a whole heart. And we're going to find ourselves in the presence of people and trusting in people and lying to ourselves in ways that we're going to find ourselves one day out of the blessings of God in our life. Though Christian in name, our life will end in tragedy. And that's one of the most tragic things ever. You imagine that in eternity, knowing that you should have given your whole heart, and you just chose not to. If you haven't even chose God, you can through Christ. He has sent His Son so that you could choose Him. By faith in Him, that He's the Son of God. By turning to Him in repentance, by giving Him your whole heart, making Him your Lord. By entering into the blessings of God through Christ. By uniting with His death and His burial and His resurrection in baptism. You can begin to live in such a way that you won't be like one of these tragic stories. You will live in such a way that you allow God to be the victor in your life, rather than you trying to be the one who's victorious all alone. I know this has challenged me. Just that first statement. Let me tell you something. It sends chills down my spine just to read. Just to read. He served God. He did what was right in the eyes of God. Oh, okay, I think that's me. I did, okay. But not with his whole heart. I can feel the weight of that statement. And I think we're supposed to. We need to feel the weight of that statement. And you feel the weight of that statement and you need to change in some way. Our family is here to help you in some way. And so I hope that this has been as convicting to you as it has been to me. Randy's going to lead us in a song. I encourage you to study this some more. Familiarize yourself with more of these themes. And be convicted by those who were faithful to God. And be convicted by those who ended in tragedy. If you have any need at this moment, pray that you would come make that known as Randy leads us in song.